Hello, everyone. David here. And you might know that Canada has a new Prime Minister. Mark Carney, former Bank of Canada and Bank of England head, won the Liberal leadership race to replace Justin Trudeau as Liberal leader. And on March 14th, he was sworn in as the 24th Prime Minister of Canada. Now, he's been able to do some things in terms of travel and dealing with trade negotiations, but Mark Carney does not have a seat in Canada, in Canadian House of Commons. So an election has been called this Sunday, and it's for April 28th.
There is so much more to do to secure Canada, to invest in Canada, to build Canada, to unite
That's exactly
Canada.
what I would say too.
That's why I'm asking for a strong, positive mandate from my fellow Canadians. I've just requested that the Governor-General dissolve Parliament and call an election for April 28th. And she has agreed.
To determine the next government and potentially give Mark Carney his first seat in Parliament. Now, if Mark Carney were to lose this election, this April 28th election would make him the shortest PM ever in Canadian history. However, Canada has many short-term PM. More specifically, there have been 8 prior prime ministers who have served 2 or less terms in the office, and we only have 24, so it's about a third. Even though Mark Carney could possibly win, I would say it's a very decent opportunity that he would possibly lose and join the list of short-term prime ministers. So I figured, why not break down all the short-term prime ministers Canada has had and kind of break them down chronologically, explain why they became prime minister, how they got there, why they didn't last that long, and what their legacy is. So if you like what I'm providing here, please leave a like and subscribe. Would really appreciate it. And without further ado, let's break down the short-term prime ministers of Canada. So the first group is a group of 4 that I will kind of lump in as one, and I'll call this the Unfantastic Four. It is 4 prime ministers who served 1 term in total. In true Canadian fashion, the first time we break a precedent, we really break it, and break it multiple times in one time. So let's break down how this happened. So when Canada was first founded in 1867, our first prime minister and one of the fathers of Confederation was John A. Macdonald. He was also Canada's leader, which was then referred to as premier, prior to Confederation. So he had a long record of being our leader, and he was essentially the first Canadian celebrity, and he was super dominant at politics and winning elections. Of the first 7 elections in Canadian history, Macdonald and his Conservatives won 6 of them, only losing the 3rd Canadian election on the back of a huge scandal involving the Canadian Railroad that was a very early topic in Canadian history and very important thing. His last election, he won in 1891, and he defeated the new Liberal leader Wilfrid Laurier, who is a very famous Canadian Prime Minister, and Macdonald managed to win at the age of 75, which, mind you, back then was considered really old at the time, given, the lack of modern medicine. Prior to this, due to Macdonald's mythic Canadian hero status, the party had on numerous times dissuaded him from stepping down, as they viewed his status and stature as key to their election success. So Macdonald didn't really make any efforts into a proper succession plan. So 1 year into his 5-year term that he got from the 1891 election, he got really sick and finally died of old age. And he was the first prime minister to die in office, and he was the oldest ever prime minister to date. Now, nowadays, people kind of scream that Mark Carney was unelected. But back then, this was truly the case, as the Governor-General, who represents either the King or Queen of England, is the one who appoints the new Prime Minister. And back then, it was a man named Lord Stanley Preston. Governor-General usually would get a recommendation from the Prime Minister. However, Macdonald never made a clear plan, so they consulted the Conservative Party, who struggled to make a clear consensus on who would be the new Prime Minister. And Senator John Abbott was chosen as a compromise candidate although Abbott himself had suggested a young Attorney General, John Thompson. Now, Abbott would be the first prime minister who would serve in the Senate rather than the House of Commons, and Abbott served for about 1 year. The main thing Abbott was known for was basically helping in by-elections and actually increase the strength of the Tory majority, which gave some people the idea that he wasn't all that bad at the job. However, his tenure was cut short because he was pretty old. He got sick of cancer and chose to resign. He would die 1 year later at the age of 72. However, since Abbott stepped down, he was able to choose a successor and recommend them to the Governor General, and he chose his original choice, the aforementioned John Thompson, and presented that to Governor General Preston. Now, John Thompson, by contrast to Abbott, was a very, very young politician at 47 when he assumed office, and was considered this huge, up-and-comer hotshot. He was the Minister of Justice, or more commonly known in today's parlance as the Attorney General, and he also made a name for himself as a critic of the MacDonald government, even though he was a cabinet member or from caucus. Some historians actually consider Thompson as one of the great what-if, quote-unquote, in Canadian history. Now, the reason John Thompson is a what-if is because he happened to die in office, the second prime minister to die in office at the young age of 49. He died while visiting Europe, and he was inducted into the Privy Council. That's why he visited, and he went on a hiking excursion while there, and he died of a heart attack. He is the second prime minister and last prime minister to date to die in office. His picture may give you a hint, but he was quite overweight and had gained weight on the job, which contributed to his poor health. Now, this original MacDonald term, might have been viewed as kind of cursed. After all, there have been 3 Johns, 2 of them have died, and we're now on to our prime minister. And it was a little bit of a crisis because obviously Thompson wasn't expecting to die, so he had no succession plan. So we had a new Governor General at this time, and that was Governor General Hamilton Gordon, and he would have to make the choice. He didn't really consult the party this time. He just wanted to make a quicker decision, so he just went with the cabinet member with the most seniority, and that was Senator Mackenzie Bowell. And he was the Minister of Customs prior to being selected to be the Prime Minister. Mackenzie Bowell would be the second and to date last Prime Minister to serve in the Senate rather than the House. And Mackenzie Bowles, he was meant to finish the term out, which had about a year left. However, there was one main issue that would be the main focus of Bowles' prime ministership, and that would be the Manitoba schools crisis. And basically, this was a sort of issue where the government wanted to stop funding to religious denominational schools. However, the Manitoba Act, which you can view as a provincial sort of constitution for common day parlance, explicitly had provisions so that religious schools could be funded. However, Bowles' government fought this in court and won the battle in court. However, this was very unpopular in a very religious society at the time and caused great strife and public lack of confidence. And the Conservative cabinet thought it was going to hurt their election chances. And they actually essentially conspired in a coup to remove Bowles from office, and they made efforts to convince the Governor General, Hamilton Gordon, to replace Bowles before the 1896 election, where Wilfrid Laurier was licking his chops to take on this weakened Conservative Party, and this coup succeeded. And it was the cabinet member Charles Tupper, who was the main external affairs minister that would speak to the Governor General, who was chosen to be leader. Tupper had a very good reputation as a founder or father of Confederation, a long-time MacDonald sort of confidant. And he was the Minister of External Affairs, which you can view as sort of foreign affairs in today's parlance. However, he was basically only the prime minister for the election period, and he didn't do that bad in the election. The Conservatives did get more votes than the Liberals. However, Laurier's Liberals got the majority of the seats with a much better vote distribution, in particular their strength in Quebec, which Conservatives had eroded. Charles Tupper actually asked the Governor General to form government regardless because they got more votes, as this was the first time that happened. However, the request was ludicrous on its face and wasn't provided. Tupper got to stay on for the next election to lose to Laurier again, And Tupper to date is the shortest term prime minister ever with 69 days. So this four basically are just kind of lumped in together historically as a sort of accident, sign of the decline of the Conservative Party. All were cabinet ministers with some prestige prior, but their reign is viewed mostly as a series of accidents in Canadian history. So the next prime minister is the 9th prime minister of Canada, and that would be Arthur Mann. So after Laurier won his term, he would win 4 in a row and have the longest consecutive reign as Canadian prime minister with 16 years. Conservative Robert Borden would defeat him, and Robert Borden would be the prime minister through World War I and win 2 elections. However, after the stress of the war, he wished to step down after massive fatigue, and he would ask the Governor General in 1920, and this time it was Governor General Cavendish, to select his finance minister, William White, to replace him. However, White declined, so Borden went to the number 2 option, and that brings in Arthur Mann, the subject here. And Arthur Mann was a cabinet minister who had several posts throughout the Borden administrations. However, he was best known as the Minister of Justice. His most notable role in that portfolio was handling the Winnipeg General Strike, where he would get lots of ire for being accused of unduly targeting strike leaders with criminal prosecution to break the strike. And this gave him a lot of, historians don't really like that, very pro-labor in general. However, he was also a firmly right-wing figure and one of the first prime ministers on the Conservative Party to be so, as the previous Conservative prime ministers were kind of moderate. He only governed Canada for about a year and 4 months before he had to go into his first general election. It was the 1921 election, where he was facing an uphill battle. The Robert Borden administration had pretty much exhausted the Canadian public's, trust after the election of 1918, with what I'll briefly just summarize as franchise manipulation under the guise of war that it's kind of a scandal and kind of something that deserves its own video, in my opinion. And Canadians were ready for a change and for the Liberals, and that's what they did. They brought in William Mackenzie King, who won the 1921 election with a majority government, and Mann and the Conservatives actually dropped to 3rd place. However, that was not the end of Arthur Mann. He would remain the Conservative leader, and the Progressive Party, who finished 2nd, actually declined the opposition role. So he was the opposition leader for the entire King first government, and he did a pretty good job in this role. He also, side note, went to university with King and hated him. So this was actually one of the first rivalries in this dynamic. Anyway, this brings the Conservative fortunes, which turned around for the 1925 election. And Arthur Mann and his Conservatives would make Canadian history, just not in a good way, at least for Mann. So in the 1925 election, the Conservatives did improve and the Liberals dropped relatively significantly, and Mann and the Conservatives won a plurality of the seats, and they won 15 more seats than King's Liberals. However, King was able to form an alliance with the Progressive Party, along with 2 seats in the Farmers' Party. King was able to use their 22 seats to retain office despite being 2nd place, thus making Arthur Mann the first and to this date only time where the party who won the most seats did not form the government in any fashion. However, fate would soon work in Mann's favor, sort of. A year into this informal coalition, things started not to work out, and Prime Minister King went to the new Governor General, Lord Byng, and requested an election because he felt he couldn't get things done. But Byng told King that it was too soon for an election, and since there was another party with more seats, they should be invited to form government, which Arthur Mann accepted for the Conservatives. And yes, King and Byng sound very much the same, thus this is actually known historically as the King-Byng affair. So Arthur Mann is the only person on this list to have 2 non-consecutive governments. And he was back as Prime Minister and would only rule for 87 days. As this move was very controversial at the time, historians actually believe that the Governor General should have granted the election even though it was too soon to the previous one, and Governor Generals since this have kind of just granted requests, even ones they don't agree with. Now, obviously, Mahan's government was kind of doomed from the start, as nothing was done for that immaculate 2nd term that would change the prior alliances. and he had to appoint acting cabinet members as opposed to full appointments because those appointments would be subject to confidence votes. However, predictably, a motion would be come in, and the Mayan government was defeated in the aforementioned 87 days. Byng would call the election, thus his maneuver of denying King only wasted 87 days, and this time King won the plurality with a much more solid minority government in the 1926 election. Mann would then stay on in politics for some time. He would drop out as the leader for the Conservatives. He would be a senator and cabinet minister for the R.B. Bennett administration. And he would also come back briefly in the 1940s during World War II to stay on as conservative leader, but he would not stay for any elections. Mann was also the last man to be appointed to this position without any type of election, such as a party election. His legacy is basically known as a transitionary figure, and there's not much to it. He's just basically part of the answer of a trivia question about the 1925 election, as the only prime minister whose party did not form government when getting the most seats. So now we move on to our next prime minister, and that is Joe Clark, who is the 16th prime minister in Canadian history. We go all the way to 1979 as the two prior guys who were initially not elected in Louis Saint Laurent and Pierre Trudeau would win elections in their own right. So Joe Clark has a little place in my heart simply because in grade 3 I was assigned him at random as a prime minister to do for a social studies project, and he is the only prime minister in this list who was actually elected to the position first. So Joe Clark came to the Conservative leadership during the era of dominance of Pierre Elliott Trudeau as prime minister, who won 3 elections in a row from 68 through 74. Clark was considered what is a red Tory, which is a very socially liberal, moderate, conservative type Tory, and in the 1976 leadership race, his social liberalism was kind of embodied in the fact that his wife's name was Maureen McTeer, using her own surname and not taking her husband's, which at the time on the Canadian Red caused some minor controversy. When Joe Clark won the leadership, when he defeated future Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, it was kind of like mocked in the media as Joe Who, as he was kind of very plain vanilla milquetoast and not really a big name. But he was kind of viewed as a safe candidate, and he was very young because he won at the age of 36 as a party leader. Now, Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, was in his 3rd term, but was residing over a very hard Canadian economic time, as much of the West was experiencing a gas shortage with what is known as a global, I'm going to use this in air quotes, Arab nation boycott. This made the father Trudeau very vulnerable, and he held off an election until the latest possible year, which back then was a 5th year of the term, 1979. Trudeau was hoping to be the 3rd prime minister after the vaunted MacDonald and Laurier to win a 4th term in a row, but as you may have guessed based on this segment, he lost to Joe Clark's Conservatives, and Clark won a minority government in 1979. The Conservatives got 136 seats with 142 the threshold. However, the Conservatives lost the national popular vote by almost 5 points, 35.8 to 40.1. There was a party called the Social Credit Party with 6 votes, which could, in theory, be a reliable partner on a case-by-case basis to put the Conservatives over the top in any vote in the House of Commons. Clark was sworn in on June 4th, 1979, one day before turning 40, and thus at 39 being the youngest prime minister ever and the only man in his 30s to have the job. Joe Clark's prime ministership would then go on to last very short, in fact the shortest elected, lasting 9 months. Essentially, his prime ministership lasted the length of a typical pregnancy. The main thing his prime ministership was known for was a foreign policy accomplishment, and his government's role in what's called the Great Canadian Caper, which was Canada's role in the Iranian hostage crisis in using the Canadian embassy in Iran to keep 6 escaped would-be U.S. diplomat hostages and work and coordinate with the CIA to help get these people out with fake Canadian credentials under the ruse of being a Canadian film studio. You might know this as the plot of the movie Argo by Ben Affleck. Argo was actually criticized in Canada for downplaying our role, which was much more collaborative and even taking the lead. Affleck even apologized for this. President Carter praised Joe Clark for his role in this later, and Clark played coy in parliamentary debate on the issue, even urging opposition leader Trudeau behind the scenes to attack him in the House of Commons to throw off any possible IRGC monitors viewing the situation. While his government did fall, however, it was simply because he was quite a novice to Parliament in general, only being elected to the House in 1972. He seemed not to understand that he had a minority government. Clark assumed he earned the right to dictate his own budget and would not accept the Social Credit Party's 6 votes to help his budget get through, and he thought that he can get his budget through regardless, and a failure on the budget is an automatic non-confidence vote.
Yeas pour 139, 139. Nays contre 133, 133.
After the ordinary hour of adjournment only with the consent of the House. Does the House consent? Right Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise on a point of order. The government has lost a vote on a matter which we have no alternative but to regard as a question of confidence, and I simply want to advise the House that I will be seeing His Excellency the Governor-General tomorrow morning.
And since his budget failed, the 1980 election was triggered. Pierre Trudeau actually previously had resigned, yet because they had not found a replacement, he had to rescind his resignation, and in the 1980 election, this time Pierre Trudeau recognized that his personality was actually an anchor in the 1979 election, and basically in 1980 he avoided the spotlight, did minimal campaigning, and didn't even go to a debate. He declined that, and the public perceived Clark as not ready for the job, as he could not even pass one budget bill. And the Liberals had got more votes in the last election, so it wasn't that hard for their support to help. This time the Liberals got a full majority, bringing the elder Trudeau back into power for what would be his final term. This term for the elder Trudeau was actually his greatest yet. Without this term, Pierre Trudeau's legacy would have been closer to an unfulfilled potential rather than a top-tier prime minister that he is kind of considered to this day. And side note, my father had indoctrinated me into thinking that he was the greatest prime minister ever. That's a little bold, but he is up there. Honestly, without this term, his son might not have been able to ride that name value to the top. So in terms of Clark himself, he would lose the leadership race in 1982 to Brian Mulroney. However, he did serve as both External Affairs Minister and Attorney General to Mulroney. This is actually very rare, and that former prime ministers would go into cabinet of new prime ministers because the new prime minister would be a little, conscious about the fact that an old prime minister would be viewed as, taking away their authority. But due to Clark's obscureness as being a prime minister and Mulroney's massive landslide, Mulroney wasn't that uncomfortable, and he brought him in. This gave Clark a lot of, respect. He would also come back for the party in 1998 and serve in the 2000 general election and actually gain his party official party status. He would also resign from the party after the party merged with the Canadian Alliance under new leader Peter MacKay. So basically, Clark kind of saved his legacy. He's not just known for being the shortest elected prime minister. He has something to kind of put his teeth on. There's a funny anecdote about Joe Clark that I read in a biography about Stephen Harper, who was the predecessor to Justin Trudeau, and basically was about Western conservatives, firm right-wing conservatives being upset about the Clark administration as well as the Mulroney. And Joe Clark had once said an anecdote that he had considered what to study in university between French and economics, and he chose French because he wanted to be prime minister, which, when you say out loud, doesn't sound serious, but is an actual consideration. Also, Joe Clark is kind of considered a the end of a bygone era for a conservative party in a much more respectable sort of era where they didn't have like sort of combative politics and sort of were more of opponents than enemies. So Joe Clark does have a lot of respect in, for what he was. So the next one is John Turner. As mentioned in the previous example, Pierre Trudeau had a term from 1980 to 1984, which kind of defined his legacy with patriation of the Canadian Constitution and defeating a Quebec separatist attempt. However, his support in Quebec as a result had waned, and he felt that he needed to leave on a high note. So Trudeau stated his intention to resign, and a leadership race was called in 1984, in which John Turner, the former Attorney General and Finance Minister under Trudeau, had narrowly defeated John Chrétien to win the leadership and thus the Prime Ministership. So Turner, and he was actually a opponent of Pierre Trudeau in the 1968 leadership race, and he actually had referenced not wanting to wait until some distant convention in the 1984 leadership convention, and that ended up being prophetic because that is actually when he won the prime ministership and liberal leadership. Turner was also considered a business liberal, a more sort of moderate liberal on social issues, and he had a very public resignation in 1974 over a key disagreement with Pierre Trudeau on economic policy, in particular implementing price freezes. And he went back to the private sector, where he was a very successful lawyer. So when he actually won in 1984, he was a seatless prime minister. Now, if you're tracking that at home, he was a seatless prime minister who replaced a Trudeau, aka probably the most perfect parallel from Carney possible. Now, what happened with John Turner and why he lost the prime ministership so quickly? Well, Trudeau had earned a 5-year term, as was the custom back then, and Turner had no obligation to call the election so early, which he did, very shortly. However, he earnestly believed he had to earn his mandate and felt that the Liberals got a bump when he became prime minister, and he didn't actually have a seat, so rather than do a by-election, he just called a general election, and he ran into the aforementioned Brian Mulroney, who replaced Joe Clark. Brian Mulroney was an Anglo-Quebecer who campaigned as a blue conservative and would rectify Quebec grievances over the constitution that Pierre Trudeau had put in. This made him win a massive, and I mean massive, landslide in 1980, and while his seat count was not the highest share ever, his volume seats were, and with a stunning win in Quebec, a rare event for conservatives, his conservatives actually won a true majority of the popular vote. To date, this is the last time that has happened in Canadian history. Turner's Liberals were actually decimated. He only won 40 seats and didn't win his own seat. He was caught flat-footed in the debate, not being able to justify ramming in a bunch of Trudeau patronage appointments, and simply ran into a really good opponent in Brian Mulroney.
You, sir, owe the Canadian people a deep apology for having indulged in that kind of practice with those kinds of appointments.
Well, I've told you and told the Canadian people, Mr. Mulroney, that I had no option.
Well,
Truman, your next question,
you
please.
had an option, sir. You could have said, I am not going to do it. This is wrong for Canada, and I am not going to ask Canadians to pay the price. You had an option, sir, to say no, and you chose to say yes to the old attitudes and the old stories of the Liberal Party. That, sir, if I may say respectfully, that is not good enough for Canadians.
I had no option. If I was able
that is an avowal of failure. That is a confession of non-leadership, and this country needs leadership. You had an option, sir. You could have done better.
To this day, John Turner is the only Liberal prime minister to stand in an election and not win at least one general election. He would, however, stay on as Liberal leader and win a by-election to get a seat. And as opposition leader, he would then stand for the 1988 election, which was called over the issue of free trade with the United States, which is stunningly similar to what this election might be with Mark Carney. So Turner actually had a really good clip in the debates that's been kind of circling around, and here we go.
I happen to believe that once you...
Mr. Turner, just one second.
Once any
you
nation...
do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian. I want to tell you that I come from a Canadian family and I love Canada. And that's why I did it, to promote prosperity. And don't you impugn my motives.
Economic levers.
Once a country yields or anyone else's.
Once a country yields its energy.
We have not done it.
Once a country yields its agriculture.
Wrong again.
Once a country opens itself up to a subsidy war with the United States on terms of definition, then the political ability of this country to sustain the influence of the United States to remain as an independent nation, that is
Mr.
lost
Turner,
forever,
Mr.
and that's
Turner,
the issue of this election.
Mr. Turner, I today, sir, as a Canadian, believe genuinely in what I am doing. I believe it is right for Canada. I believe that in my own modest way, I am nation building because I believe this benefits Canada and I love Canada.
We built a country, east and west and north. We built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years, we've done it. With one signature of a pen, you've reversed that, thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States, and will reduce us, I'm sure, to a colony of the United States, because when the economic levers go, the political independence is sure to follow.
So a lot of people are kind of saying maybe Turner was right, though we never imagined a hostile president. But let's not talk about American presidents here. Turner's leadership, however, was challenged in 1990 after losing the 1988 election, and he would lose the rematch with John Chrétien, and he would not contest his seat in the 1993 election. He recently died in 2020, and his 79-day prime ministership, which was the second shortest, was kind of brought up in the byline, and people kind of were like, oh, that's kind of rude, because he did kind of earn respect and garner respect for his work prior and after. So Turner has a relatively comfortable legacy, despite not having one as prime minister. So the final person on this list is Kim Campbell, our first ever female prime minister. Now, as mentioned earlier, Brian Mulroney's Conservatives dominated the 80s, winning in 84 and 88 with large majorities. However, a variety of issues sunk Brian Mulroney's popularity. He implemented a general service tax, which was annoying because people don't like taxes, along with initial resistance from the public to the U.S. free trade, which did go through but was not that popular. In addition, he failed to deliver to Quebec and fractured his support in the party in multiple ways. And the first one is based off his failure for constitutional reforms with what were known as the Michelet Accord and the Charlottetown Accord. His college friend and cabinet minister Lucien Bouchard was upset that Quebec was not given its distinct society protections for the French language, and he had organized a splinter with the prior Quebec closet nationalists, or even separatists, and formed a federal party, Bloc Québécois. Now, in addition to the Quebec separation, the Western wing, which was considered the more right-wing wing of the party, believed that Mulroney's government was trying to pander too much into Quebec and did not support his tax. So Preston Manning, the son of a famous Alberta premier, and Stephen Harper, a kind of right-wing pundit or think tank guy, formed the Reform Party, which contested in the 88 election but had not won any seats because free trade became the issue, so all the right-wing votes consolidated. But they did win one by-election and were in the parliament for Mulroney. Now, the Reform Party was meant to be a true conservative right-wing party because they viewed the actual Conservative Party as being liberals doing the speed limit, and immigration, anti-immigration more precisely, was a key plank of that party. So along with some other scandals related to his privatization schemes, Brian Mulroney was polling abysmally, around 17%. He announced his intent to resign in 1993, and the party sought a replacement in a leadership race. Newly elected and fast riser Attorney General Kim Campbell was seen as a favorite as she came from the social credit wing of the BC party and wasn't really tied to the government. The fact that she was a woman in a time where not many women were in parliament was also viewed as an advantage. And she was able to win the Conservative leadership and thus prime ministership on a second ballot. And she became Canada's first and only woman prime minister to date. He, however, would go into an election in 1993 where it was an uphill battle with the splinter of her party from two sides, the Quebec nationalists and the right-wing reform side. And I would hesitate to blame Kim Campbell for losing the 1993 election. But losing like really badly is another thing. During the campaign, she made a gaffe when speaking of the economy. However, forget about the gaffes. The main thing was this negative that her campaign put out, and it really kind of sunk her image. Her opponent was John Chrétien, who, based on this picture you might be able to gather, had a partial stroke at a very young age, which left him with part of his face paralyzed, where it kind of looked like he was kind of talking on one side of his mouth, for lack of a better word. And this ad was used, and it was known as the face ad.
Mr. Prime Minister, Does he understand that his plan to allow a deficit each year would increase our debt? How can he believe that you can kickstart a modern economy by fixing some roads? Why doesn't he answer the questions he's asked? Doesn't he understand the questions? Or the answers? Or both? Jean Chrétien, a prime minister? Think twice.
As you can see, that ad is not particularly tasteful, and a lot of people can see the subtle messaging at the time. And in Canada, there's a very low appetite for negative ads, especially on personal basis. Policy based, that's one thing. Personal, we don't appreciate that, unlike America. Now, it was not well received. It didn't air that many times, but it did not bolster the Prime Minister's slim chances. Now, how badly did Kim Campbell lose? Very, very, very badly. Her and the Conservatives were not second, they were not third, they did not finish fourth, but they finished fifth. And they won 2 seats, 156 prior and 2. Kim Campbell was not one of those seats. Now, this was quite an embarrassing defeat. The election this is actually one of the biggest turning point elections in Canadian history, as it began a 13-year run for the Liberals. However, with the Separatists getting official opposition, it would lead to a Quebec referendum where Quebec nearly decided to separate, which was barely defeated in 1995. It also changed the right wing of Canadian politics forever. Reform was now the dominant right-wing party. They would contest another election, then they would merge with the Canadian to become a Canadian alliance with religious conservatives, and then they would end up merging with the actual conservative parties in 2003. And going back to our friend Joe Clark, when this happened, he resigned, and he said that his party died that day. He viewed the new party as the Reform Party in conservative uniforms. So, kind of interesting sort of moment in Canadian history that kind of Kim Campbell was a part of, just kind of by being a bystander. Now, Kim Campbell herself, unlike everyone else I kind of mentioned, did not have a long, extensive career. Basically, her novelty is just being a woman prime minister as the first one. And that keeps her notable. And, Canadians like saying we do something that America hasn't done. So we do kind of point that out. But she was the only woman to serve. She got decimated in an election. And I don't know if we want to point it out. The lack of any accomplishments really after the fact kind of makes it very obscure. People actually do hold John Turner and Joe Clark in much higher regard, despite the fact that John Turner's was much shorter, at least. However, like the person who graduates medical school with the lowest GPA, being a doctor, Kim Campbell will always, forever be a prime minister with a portrait, and can't take that away from her. So there you go. That's a hopefully brief rundown of our prime ministers with short tenures. Will Mark Carney join this list, or will he be able to win and avoid that fate of being the new Charles Tupper? Thanks for taking the time to watch. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think Mark Carney will join this? I guess I'm asking for you to ballpark the election. And what do you think of these other 8? Which one's the most interesting? Thanks for taking the time. Take care.